We are talking today with John Perkins. He is author of the new book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. John, thank you for spending time with us today.
It's great to be here, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Start out and tell us, what was the motivation in writing your book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
9/11 was the motivation. I'd put off writing this book for a long time. I was sworn to secrecy. I'd been bribed not to write it. I'd been threatened when I tried to write it earlier. And I'd postponed it. I'd put off writing it until 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, I knew this story had to be told. It has to get out there. Most of the American people are totally unaware of what really goes on with our foreign policy, of what our banks and corporations are doing around the world, of the way we're building empire, and of the way we're irritating people. We're creating a lot of enemies around the world. I don't think that 9/11 happened as just one crazy fringe terrorist and his group of people all by themselves. It happened because there's a tremendous undercurrent that supports that sort of thing. Much of the world looks at bin Laden as a Robin Hood. Now, what he did is despicable. It's terrible. It's a heinous crime. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the world looks at him as a good guy because he's taking on the empire as they see it. Most Americans don't understand that. If we understood it, if we understood the way the world feels about us, I think we would change. We're a very compassionate people, and we would make that change. And incidentally, in the last couple of days, I've seen my book go to the top of the list at Amazon.com to #1 and then stay in the number 10 spot. So the message is getting out there, and I find that extremely encouraging because people need to know what we're doing, and then we can create change. We have a tremendous opportunity here to move into a new world, and for America to be a leader in creating a feeling of compassion and a republic, a true democracy and a true republic around the world that begins to attack some of the serious problems that humanity is facing.
Tell us, how is it that you got brought into the profession that you held?
Well, while I was still in business school in 1968, the National Security Agency recruited me. And the way that happened was that I was married to a woman whose father was very high up in the Department of the Navy, and one of his best friends was very high up in the National Security Agency. So they offered to interview me for a job, and I went in and I spent a couple of days there, especially one very intensive period when I was under lie detector interviews. And during that period of time, they discovered many weaknesses in me. I have a lot of weaknesses, and they identified me as a good candidate for an economic hitman. And then I was sent into the Amazon rainforest by the Peace Corps. I went into the Peace Corps for a short period of time, 3 years actually, and went into the Amazon and worked with people who were very strongly opposed to what the oil companies are doing to the Amazon, indigenous people there in the Amazon. It was really part of my training. While I was still there, a vice president from a major international consulting firm came down, and who also had connections with the National Security Agency and knew that they had identified me and recruited me for this job, because economic hitmen work through private corporations, not directly for the government. That keeps everything much more secret, and it leaves the government out. The government cannot be implicated as long as this is being done through private consultants. The consulting firms, of course, are paid by the U.S. government as consulting firms, and people like me, then my salary was paid by this consulting firm. But it was very clear, it was very obvious to me what I was supposed to do, and after I agreed to join this effort, I was then trained by an amazing woman who's described in detail in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Her name is Claudine, and she was very beautiful, very seductive, extremely talented, knew exactly what to do, knew all the hooks, knew all my weaknesses, and brought me in. You know, I like to think of myself as a good person at heart, and I grew up in a family in New Hampshire that came from over 300 years of Yankee Calvinists. We have very strong moral values, very principled, and I think I'm a really good case in point of how the system can seduce you, how there's three very powerful drugs in our lives these days: sex, money, and power. And I was seduced by all three of those.
So when you went into the Peace Corps, was that your own idea, or were you nudged in that direction?
Well, I'd been recruited by the National Security Agency, and while I was still in business school, I happened to go to a Peace Corps recruiting speech, and was quite taken by the recruiter. And I, as I mentioned, grew up in rural New Hampshire. I come from a long line of Yankees who killed Indians and made love with Indians and created children with them. And I'd always been fascinated by the Abenaki tribe, which I have a little bit of blood from, and always fascinated by Indian lore. And so as I heard this Peace Corps recruiter speak afterwards, I went up to him and I said, is there any possibility if I joined the Peace Corps of going to a place like the Amazon and living with people who live as our indigenous people did here 200-300 years ago? And he said, absolutely. Nobody wants to go to the Amazon. If you volunteer for that, I think you'll be sent there. And then I called this man who had recruited me at the National Security Agency, and I told him about this and told him I was torn because I wanted to go to the NSA, but I also was intrigued by this. He said, go. We'll make sure that you get into the Amazon. He said, that's where all the action is. These are the people who are opposing our oil companies. We need the Amazon for oil. This will be a great experience for you. When you come out, you can work for us.
And it was while you were down there that one of the representatives from the company that you would be working at showed up?
Right. I'd been there about 2 years. I was. It's a 2-year assignment in the Peace Corps, but I'd extended for a third year because I really enjoyed it. And I was also not interested in going to Vietnam, and I had another year before I turned 26 and was no longer draftable. And after the second year, this gentleman showed up. He's talked about extensively in the book and named in the book, and told me he'd be interested in hiring me. And for a year after that, we corresponded. I wrote a lot of letters to him. He asked me a lot of questions about the economy of Ecuador. He was really testing me. He was checking me out. He was seeing where my loyalties were and whether I was able to write reports on the economy of people and really check out the people. So I did that. I passed that test, and a year later he brought me up to Boston, where the headquarters of this company were, and recruited me.
But you had no sense of that at the time, that he was feeling you out for a potential job, or? Oh
yes, I certainly had an inkling of that. Yeah, it was very exciting to me to think that this was going on, because after all, when I talked to the man from the National Security Agency who originally arranged for my interviews and told him of my desire to go in the Peace Corps, he encouraged me. He was the one who said, you can always come to work for us afterwards. So I had a real strong sense that that's what was going on.
Okay, so you then came back and you joined this company, Chas T. Main?
Correct. And we called it Charles. It was spelled C-H-A-S, but Chas T. Main, we usually called it Main just for short. Right. Big. We had about 2,000 employees in Boston. It was what's called a closely held corporation, which means basically a partnership. About 5% of these 2,000 employees owned the company. They were what we call partners. And I became one of those eventually. I became chief economist of that firm, and I ended up having roughly 50 people working for me over time.
And what type of work does that company do?
Well, interesting. The company called itself an engineering construction firm, and we never did any real construction. We never owned any equipment, and in fact we prided ourselves on saying we're objective. We don't need to go into countries and tell them to build big systems because we don't gain anything from it. We're not like Bechtel or Halliburton, Stone & Webster, any of the big construction companies. We don't do that. But the fact of the matter is, our job was to convince other countries to take very large loans, and then to convince the World Bank and other such organizations to give these countries huge loans, let's say $1 billion, to Ecuador, to build big infrastructure projects, power plants and transmission lines and distribution systems, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that didn't benefit anybody except the very wealthy people in those countries, who were quite corrupt, and we corrupted them. So our job was to convince, let's say, Ecuador to accept $1 billion loan, convince the World Bank to give Ecuador $1 billion loan. 90% of that $1 billion would come back to the United States to pay for Halliburton, Bechtel, these kinds of, or these types of companies, to build the infrastructure, and then which would only serve the wealthiest people in those countries, and then the country would be stuck with this huge debt, which over time would continue to be refinanced and get larger and larger and larger, so that in fact today Ecuador owes more than 50% of its national budget just to pay down its debt service, which means there's very little money left to go to pay for the education or health services for the poor people, who are the ones who suffered from these projects. It was their rivers that were destroyed as we built hydroelectric plants. It was their land that was destroyed, and while a few of their people got wealthy, as a few of ours did. So now they're saddled with this incredible debt that they can't possibly pay. And so we go in and demand our pound of flesh, very much like the mafia. That's why we called ourselves hitmen. So today, for example, this is actually what's happened in Ecuador. And today, we need Ecuador's oil. We need the oil from this Amazon area where these indigenous people live that I worked with as a Peace Corps volunteer. And we tell Ecuador, since you can't pay off your loans, what you need to do is turn over your Amazon to our oil companies. And that's what they're doing. And the indigenous people there, the ones I worked with now, have basically declared war. They said, we're not allowing these oil companies to come in. We're going to fight to the very last man if we have to. It's a terrible situation, and what it is all about is building empire. We've done this in every country around the world that has resources that we covet. Often this is oil in places like Indonesia, Nigeria, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, so many different places, but sometimes it's other resources. For example, in Panama, it was the Panama Canal. And in this process, we've managed to create the largest empire in the history of the world, and we've done it largely without military might. It's been done primarily through economic hitmen like me. Now, when the economic hitmen fail, as we did in Panama with Omar Torrijos, and in Ecuador many years ago with Jaime Roldos when I was there, when we fail, the jackals are sent in. And these are CIA-sanctioned troublemakers. They will try to foment coups in a country. They'll try to overthrow the president. If they fail, if they're not able to do that, then they'll assassinate him. And Jaime Roldos of Panama, who was not overthrown, so he was assassinated. And Omar Torrijos Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, Omar Torrijos of Panama, the same thing happened. We economic hitmen failed. The jackals went in and assassinated these presidents. It happened with Allende in Chile, Arbenz in Guatemala. It's part of what Vietnam was about. And when the jackals fail and the economic hitmen both fail, as in Iraq, the final step is for us to send in our young men and women to die and to kill. And that's what we're doing in Iraq today.
All right, I want to back up a bit and go back to when you're a young man and you're being initially trained by Claudine. What was involved in that? How long did that take?
And Claudine's training of me took a number of months. There was about 9 months between the time when Maine hired me and I went on my first assignment to Indonesia, and Claudine was training me during a great deal of that time, on and off. All of my training occurred in this very plush apartment, small apartment, but very plush on Beacon Street in Boston. Our headquarters, Maine's headquarters, was the Prudential Center in Boston, and this was very close to there. It was never done in our offices. It was very, very clandestine. I would spend tremendous amounts of time at Claudine's apartment, and she seduced me in every possible way. I was very seducible. She was gorgeous. She was intelligent. She was sensual. She was an amazing woman. And at the same time, she told me in no uncertain terms what was to be expected of me as an economic hitman, and told me that, and she called it a dirty business. And she said, we need to make sure that you're totally comfortable doing this and going off and doing this. If you're not comfortable doing it, then don't do it. Don't go to Indonesia. Don't take on this assignment, because once you're in for life. You can't turn back. So part of her training of me was to seduce me into it, but at the same time make absolutely certain that I was buying into it, that I was going to be a part of it.
And it's your belief that she had access to the information that the NSA had gotten out of you during the polygraph tests?
Correct. I have no doubt about that. She knew what my weaknesses were. She zeroed right in on them. I grew up the son of a prep school teacher in a private school in New Hampshire, and lived on the campus all my life. My dad didn't get paid much money at all. Everything was free. Our house was free. Our food was free. The lawns were mowed for us. The snow plowed. Everything was free. So we lived a pretty decent life, but I never had any cash. And I was surrounded all my life by boys who came from very, very wealthy families all over the world. And I heard their stories. And then I went to school with these boys. And they would go home on vacation to Venezuela, to Caracas, to Beirut, to London, to wherever they were from, and I would be stuck in this little campus all by myself in Tilton, New Hampshire, and very lonely. I'd basically been rejected by the town, and I'd rejected the town because there was animosity between the townies and the preppies, and I saw myself as a preppy. So some of it was self-imposed. But these guys would come back from their vacations with these amazing stories to tell, the debutante balls they'd been to, and the orgies, and my life was so boring, and I developed this complex that I really wanted to excel, and I wanted to live that kind of a life. Then I went to Middlebury College, and much of the same there. That there were a lot of wealthy people at Middlebury. So I had this desire, and I was extremely shy around women, incredibly shy around women, and pathetically shy around women. And I had this complex, and Claudine knew this. The NSA had identified this, and Claudine appealed to every side of it. She, it's just amazing. And then, as an economic hitman, I traveled always first class. I rode up in the bump of the 747s. I was always first class. Stayed in the best hotels wherever I went, sometimes the best suites in the best hotels. Ate at the best restaurants. Wined and dined around the world by people like the Shah of Iran and the presidents of various countries. I spent time with Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank. It was quite a life. It was everything I'd ever dreamed about having, really. It was the realization of my fantasies.
So tell us about your first assignment in Indonesia.
Yes, I was sent to Indonesia as part of a team of 11 men who were there to design an electrical system for Java, the island of Java, which was the most heavily populated piece of real estate in the world at the time. Now, the reason we were going to Indonesia, this is in the early 70s, it was pretty obvious by then that Vietnam was going to fall. And the theory was the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, then the rest of the Southeast Asian countries would fall too, and we had to stop that. We were losing in Vietnam. We had to figure out a different way, not the military solution. And Indonesia was seen as the key to this. Indonesia had a lot of oil, so that was important. It had a huge population of people. It was a very populated country. And it had the largest population of Muslims of any country in the world. And so there were many good reasons for us to go into Indonesia. So we went into Indonesia and did this study and did projections showing that if they built up their electrical system, if they took a huge loan from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and built up their electrical system, their economy would boom over the next 2 decades. And we arranged for the loan from the banks. And basically what we were doing was bringing Indonesia into our realm. We were saddling them with huge debts. We were going to use our own companies, and we did, to build these systems. So the money, we arranged for the World Bank to make a loan to Indonesia. The money came to our corporations in the United States. Indonesia ended up with all this amazing debt. Now, I should say, Mike, that I was the only person on that 11-man team that knew the subtleties of what we were doing. I was the only economic hitman. I was the economist. I was the one who did all the forecasts. I was the one to arrange the loans. That all fell on me. The other men on that team were designing power plants, were designing the highways and ports to bring the fuels in to fuel the power plants, designing transmission lines, distribution systems, that sort of work. And throughout the industry, when I talk about these other companies, the Bechtels, the Halliburtons, the Stone & Websters, the Charles T. Mains, and the World Bank, I want to make it very clear that the majority of the people working for those organizations are not economic hitmen. They are technicians, they're engineers, they're doing what they believe is their job of designing systems. But there's always somebody at the top, there's always somebody in that organization that has a complete understanding of what's going on. It's very few people most of these people are in the dark about this, and they shouldn't be in the dark about it. I mean, it should be pretty obvious to them what they're doing, as it should be pretty obvious to all of us in this country where our tax money is going. It isn't that obvious. The system is an amazingly subtle and an incredibly effective system.
But wasn't there one person on your team in Indonesia who did seem to have an inkling of that things weren't entirely right?
Howard Parker, retired executive with the New England Electric System. He'd spent his life resisting pressure from others, and he was a very bitter man at this point. He had never been promoted to where he thought he should be in the New England Electric System. He'd retired and come to work for Maine as a consultant, and he knew what we were trying to do. We were trying to inflate all these forecasts. I was given the assignment of making sure that I showed that economic and load electric power growth would grow something around 17% a year, which is a huge number when you compound this over 20, 25 years. Howard was determined that it wouldn't be more than 6 or 8%, as he said. That's the norm. And I kept arguing, but this isn't the norm. This is a country that's booming. And yeah, I talk in a great deal of detail about Howard and how angry he was. But from my standpoint, Howard was a bitter old man, and he hadn't got what he wanted out of life, and he wasn't going to be around there long. So what I wanted to do was learn all I could from him and basically take over his job. So he wasn't really coming from a highly principled area, in my perception. It wasn't. It was a question of stubbornness. It was a question of bitterness. And I saw, well, I'm a young man on the make, and I know what I'm supposed to do. And Claudine's told me, and I just don't want Howard to get in my way. But at one point, I had this realization that I all through this, I was going through tremendous qualms and guilt. I knew that what I was doing was not the right thing, but I was being well rewarded, and what I was doing was legal, and in fact praised by people like Robert McNamara and people that I looked up to. And so at one point, Howard made it very clear to me that it didn't matter what I came up with for an economic forecast. If I came up with 17% economic forecast, then his electric load forecast would have been roughly in the same area. There's a very strong correlation between economic growth and energy growth in any country or any region. And so it was my job to come up with this high economic forecast, and then he was supposed to match his electrical load forecast to that. He made it very clear that he wasn't going to do that. Didn't matter what I came up with, he would come up with something between 5 and 10%. Which he figured was reasonable. So suddenly this light went off, and I said, my God, I've been relieved of the guilt. I can do what my masters have told me to do, what Claudine's told me to do, what everybody's telling me to do, come up with these high economic forecasts, and he'll come up with the electric load forecasts that are the real ones, the reasonable ones. And so I'm off the hook. They'll have to follow his electric load forecasts, because that's what the system would have to be designed with. And they should follow the economic forecast, but if he doesn't follow the economic forecast, then it's the burden's off me. So I felt so relieved. Of course, when I got back to Boston, Howard left long before me, left Indonesia because he got very sick, so we had to send him home. And he said he had all the information he could do the rest of his work from home. When I got home, my boss, who later became the president of Charles T. Maine, called me into the office, and he said, I'm firing Howard Parker. Doesn't matter what you say here now, what you do, I'm firing Howard Parker, because his forecasts are unreasonable. I understand, he said to me, that your economic forecast would justify much higher load forecasts, and that you now are in a position where you could develop those load forecasts. Is that correct? He said, and I said, yes, that is correct. He said, congratulations, you've just been promoted. I took it. I gave them the load forecast they wanted, and my star was bright. I eventually became a partner in the firm, chief economist with a big staff, wonderful people working for me, and it's all in the book. I was compromised at that point, beyond reconciliation.
But you would do things regularly, for instance, sticking with Indonesia, that would feed your doubt. For instance, if I remember correctly, in Indonesia, you went out with a local person there who took you to meet people who lived there, and they openly challenged in casual conversation some of the things you were doing.
That's correct. I've always liked people a lot, and originally I wanted to be a journalist, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I loved being with the people. So when I was in Indonesia, this young man, his name was Razzie, who I lived in the same house as him. He lived in the guest house. His mother ran the guest house where our team lived. And he introduced me to a lot of his friends, and I loved being with them, these Indonesian people. I learned to speak Bahasa Indonesia quite well at the time. And so I spent a lot of time with them. And yeah, they were quite radical. And there's a whole series in the book about some of the experiences I had with them, going to puppet shows, their politics, their anger at what we were doing in Vietnam. And I agreed with them, and they were quite stunned that I would agree with them so much. And they took me into these amazing, beautiful parts of the city, the old city of Bandung, which is in West Java. We were working out of Jakarta and Bandung, and I was traveling around a lot of Indonesia. I was always shocked by how there were no other foreigners in those parts of the city. No other foreigners really hanging out with the Indonesians. There were quite a few foreigners, oil company people and people like my own team. We all hung out at these private clubs and the fancy restaurants, but didn't hang out with the Indonesians very much. And I did, and I really, really enjoyed it. And they questioned me a lot, and they pointed out that Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, in 1954 had written a book called Civilization on Trial, which said that in the long run, the Muslim people are the biggest threat to capitalism, to the U.S. way. Back in 54, he said it isn't communism. That's not ultimately a threat because it's not spiritual enough. It's not based in any real strong principles. For a culture to succeed, it has to be very principled. And he demised the fall of capitalism, what he called the West, because he said ultimately we won't be that principled either, and that the Islamic world would rise up because they have these strong beliefs in spirituality, and they don't believe in usury, and they don't believe in lending money. And these young Muslims in Indonesia pointed that out to me and said, you guys are in trouble. This is back in the early 70s, and they said, the Muslim world is watching and we don't like what we're seeing. It was an amazing forewarning for, if you look at what's going on now in the world, the Muslims have become very powerful and very, very angry at us. And it isn't simply about religion by any means. The Muslim religion at heart is not an angry religion. It's a compassionate religion. But they're very angry because they see us as basically raping their world, pillaging it. And, they were always quoting statistics to me. We have a statistic that we throw around in this country a lot, that 5% of the world's population, us, the American population, consumes 25% of the world's resources. Now, that really bothers most of the rest of the world, that we're like this great octopus that reaches out with its tentacles and brings all the resources into us, and look at the lives we lead, while 3/4 of the world lives in destitution. Every day, 24,000 people die of starvation. And 30,000 children die of curable diseases every single day. And the people who live in the places where that's happening are angry. And they see us, 5% of the world's population, bringing in 25% of its resources, while so many of them live tragic, destitute, miserable, suffering lives. Needlessly suffering. It doesn't have to happen. But an even more important statistic, I believe, is that of that 5% of the world's population, only less than 1% controls more of America's resources than the 90% at the bottom. So in fact, 25% of the world's resources are being funneled into this country essentially to serve 1% of 5% of the world's population. Terribly small. It's not even a pyramid. It's like a needle going up with a few very wealthy, very powerful people sitting on the top. It's created tremendous resentment around the world. It's what's created our insecurity. I would suggest that we will never be secure in this country, no matter how many guards we have at our airports, until we decide that we're going to be a lot more compassionate with the world. And what a great thing that is to do. That will bring us the security that we need, is when we start really opening ourselves up to the world and welcoming the world as brothers and sisters who we want to share the goodies with. And back in those days in Indonesia, these young Islamic people who I fell in love with and was working with saw all this. They anticipated it, and they warned me about it. And it was a very telling experience for me, very moving. And yet, I was seduced. Sex, money, and power was coming my way, man, and I was gonna take it, and I did, for too long.
So what was your next assignment after that? What was the next big project you were saddled with, or country?
Yeah, after that, I kind of began spreading out and hiring other people to work with me. So I did a lot of work in the next few years in Panama, and I also went back to Indonesia to do the same sort of thing we'd done in Java up on the island of Sulawesi, and Colombia, and Iran. So for 3 or 4 years, my time was very much split between those countries, and I would take other journeys into Egypt and Guatemala and many other places, and I began hiring and hiring and hiring. I mean, I became very popular within Charles T. Main because I was going along with the system, and the World Bank was loving what I was doing, and I just kept expanding my department. I became a partner. I was making a lot of money, and for the company as well as for myself. So it involved quite a few countries. But, you know, the ones that had the greatest impression on me after Indonesia were Panama and Iran, and then Saudi Arabia.
All right, I want to go into a little more detail on those, but first, you had spoken about how people on your team when you were in Indonesia didn't have a grasp of the bigger picture of what was going on there. You were the single person that did. Once you started expanding your staff, were other people who were part of your staff, did they have the big picture? And then also, what about people at the World Bank and these other large organizations that you're kind of a front company for? Did they have the big picture?
Great question, Mike. And the question to the answer to both of those questions is essentially no. At the World Bank, there were people that knew, and the people at the top certainly knew. But most of the people who were analyzing my reports and did not, and in fact would try to punch holes in my forecasts. I had to defend them very, very strongly, which I became very expert at doing and very good at doing. So these people were hired basically to pick apart the reports of consultants. But their bosses knew. They were part of the system. There were always, in all of these organizations, there are a few people who are the economic hitmen who know what's going on, and the rest are pretty much kept in the dark, and they're doing their jobs, what they see as their jobs. But in the end, the economic hitmen win out because we all know. I mean, so if you're a PhD economist who's assigned to pick apart my study and punch holes in it if you can, you do that. I defend it strongly. Your boss is on my side ultimately. He's an economic hitman too. So in the end, I'm going to win. But there's going to be a song and a dance. So there's a great paper trail that shows that you really did your job. You tried to punch holes in me, but in the end, you became convinced that everything I was saying was true, was fact. And you get promoted, and you get a good bonus. Well, maybe at the World Bank it's a different set of bonus systems, but you get the goodies too by going along ultimately. It was, as far as the people that I hired is concerned, and this became a very important part of my final decision to leave that world, because I kept hiring young men and women to go out and do the same thing I was doing, but I never told them that they were doing it. They did not get the benefit that I get of a Claudine who trained them and said, this is what you're going to do and you're in for life. Instead, I told them what the results were that I wanted. If they went off to work in Saudi Arabia or Bolivia or wherever I sent them, I let them know that they better damn well come back with really high forecasts, with the kind of numbers that I wanted to see. If they didn't, they wouldn't have a job. If they did, they would get promoted. They would get good Christmas bonuses. I mean, I controlled all that. And I also was very manipulative in convincing them. I mean, and at the time I was also publishing a lot of professional papers. I had a couple of very astute young people working for me. One was a PhD from MIT, in a mathematician. He got his PhD from MIT when he was 22 years old. He was a young man from India, and brilliant. and he produced the kind of results I wanted. We wrote these papers, so we had a whole system in place of convincing everybody that what they were doing was right, and then rewarding them, or the carrot and stick approach, that they get well rewarded when they did what I wanted, and if they didn't do it, they didn't get rewarded, and they might get fired. So they didn't have the same benefit that I did of being told, this is what you're doing. And in the end, that made me feel very guilty that I'd manipulated people like that. It was one of the reasons that I wanted to get out, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book, because that's typical throughout these organizations. There are people doing that. Throughout the corporate world, I know people who work for big corporations now that are outsourcing, that have sweatshops in Asia producing the goods that they're selling in the United States, paying people $1 a day or less, people who are working in terrible conditions, and the men and women who are in charge of those operations out of places like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and various other places. These men and women are going into these countries. They know, in their hearts, they know that what they're doing isn't right. But back home in the headquarters office is a whole team of psychologists, lawyers, and others telling them that what they're doing is fine, it's good, and that the people who are working in the sweatshops getting $1 a day are better off than as if they didn't have those jobs, which is patently absurd, because those people, many of them lived on subsistence economies. True, they may never have made any money before, but they lived very well on subsistence economies until these companies came in and created a local market, a local economy that now depends on the dollar. So in a very few years, they've gone from living subsistence lives and statistically having no money at all, totally impoverished statistically, but their lives are quite good, to now suddenly having to work for these big corporations, working in these sweatshops, making $1 a day, dependent on the dollar economy, or maybe it's $10 a day, whatever, but dependent on that money, and this subsistence existence they had before is gone, and then that company the next year decides that the labor pool is cheaper someplace else, and they move out. And these people who become dependent on these pittances they've been paid by our companies suddenly don't have even the pittance. And it's a terribly tragic situation. And the men and women who are the equivalent of the corporate economic hit people who are doing this, I know them. I know a number of them personally. In their hearts, they know what they're doing is wrong, but they're being well rewarded. Their families are being taken care of. Someone's patting them on the back saying, isn't it wonderful that you're making it possible for these people to get $1 a day? And they have a whole team, as I said before, psychologists, economists, and lawyers telling them that everything they do is perfectly good and for the best of the world. That's how we build empire.
So tell us about Panama, because it became evident when you read the book that you actually ended up having a friendly relationship with that country's leader.
Omar Torrijos, yes, I would like to think of him as a good friend, and you know, as I think I said earlier, Mike, sometimes when I look at my own story, and I just heard you ask that question, I'm thinking Omar Torrijos. When I first went to Panama, his picture was up on this billboard, and he was a mythical figure to me. He was probably going to be up for a Nobel Prize had he not been assassinated. He was one of these bigger than life people, and to think that I spent time with him and met him, as I look back, is just pretty amazing to me. This young man from rural New Hampshire, my life, it seems unbelievable to me at times. If I hadn't lived it, I'm not sure. And as you read the book, I tried to write it to bring out some of that feeling, and sometimes it reads more like a James Bond novel, I think, than the biographies of most economists. But that's the life I lived. It was that way. Great food, great booze, fast women, and lots of power, money, sex, the whole works, you know. And Omar Torrijos was a magnificent man. He had his faults, like everybody, but he saw that clearly what I was going to do. He invited me to this little bungalow outside Panama City to have a private meeting with him, and he said, look, you know, I know what you're doing. I know the game you guys are playing. And I know what you're going to do is inflate all these forecasts, and you're going to give me a system that I can use and a few of my wealthy friends, but my country's going to suffer, and your country's going to get rich, and you're going to have a hold on me. What you really want is my canal. So I'm not going to let this happen. He said, you know, but what I will do is if you will agree with me to come in here and do a study and you know, put together a plan that really helps my people, helps the poorest of the poor, then I'll see to it that you and your company get more and more projects. But you got to be honest, you got to do good work. So basically what he was telling me is, don't be an economic hitman, be what you know, truly be what you say you are, and do a good job at it. And I welcomed this, of course, and ultimately so did my company, because it got business. But of course, what Omar Torrijos was doing in this process was defying the whole system, because the system is built on an assumption that the people at the top are all corruptible. And if you find someone at the top who isn't corruptible, then he can destroy the system, not only in that country, but in many other places. Because once someone starts to resist and someone starts to point out the truth behind the system and the fact that it can be opposed, then everybody in the system sees a threat and is in trouble. We've watched this happen so many places. Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Torrijos in Panama. We've seen it happen in Africa. We've seen it happen in Asia, in the Middle East. We've seen it happen over and over and over again. And these men who take that stance are taking their lives in their hand, literally. Now, Torrijos successfully ultimately negotiated a canal treaty with President Carter's administration. The canal treaty passed our Congress by one vote, and it was very divisive. And of course, the right-wing conservative elements strongly opposed it. The other thing that was happening is that Torrijos was negotiating with the Japanese to build a sea-level canal. The current canal is based on locks, and it can't take the largest of our ships. And so a sea-level canal would be able to do this. So the Japanese were saying that they would finance it, and then, of course, if they financed it, they would construct it. Well, this deeply upset our big construction companies. And at that time, the president of one of those largest companies was George Shultz. The senior counsel lawyer at Bechtel was Caspar Weinberger. They were very incensed that Torrijos was even talking to the Japanese about this. After the canal treaty was negotiated, Carter then lost the next election to Reagan. Shultz came out of being president of Bechtel and became Secretary of State. Weinberger left Bechtel and became Secretary of Defense. And the Reagan administration tried to renegotiate the canal treaty with Torrijos. He wouldn't do it. They tried to get him to agree to specifics like leaving our military bases in there. And most importantly of all, they desperately tried to get him to stop talking to the Japanese about a sea-level canal. He refused. He was a very integritous man in these regards. He absolutely refused. And so one day his Twin Otter plane, the presidential plane, blew up, and he was killed. And I was waiting for it to happen. This is the way the jackals do things. And there was a lot of evidence that a tape recorder that he'd been given before the plane took off was a bomb. There's no question in my mind, and there's no question in a lot of the minds of a lot of the investigators throughout South America. People knew that this was a CIA-orchestrated assassination. Of course, it hardly made our press. And next, Noriega took over. And Noriega was not an Omar Torrijos by any means. He was a much more corrupt individual. He had a lot of very unpleasant personal habits. He was not charismatic. But he stuck to his guns to a large degree. He, too, refused to give up negotiating with the Japanese. He refused to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. He refused to allow the American military bases to stay. They left and went to Ecuador. So as an upshot of that, of course, we invaded Panama in 1989. 2,000 to 3,000 Panamanians, innocent civilians, were killed in the process. And Noriega was taken prisoner and still sits in a prison in Miami, Florida.
Did you ever hear firsthand about using the jackals if you guys failed in your endeavors? Was that something that Claudine had told you about, or I mean, how do you know that for sure?
Yeah, Claudine did tell me about that. It was one of the motivating forces for me to do a good job, and all of us economic hitmen, we didn't want to see the jackals come in. I sure did not want to see Omar Torrijos assassinated. So it was an inspiration for us. It was one of the things that concerned me when I worked out this deal with Omar, to really do the real job rather than the economic hitman job. And I talk about this extensively in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that at one point I got very concerned that Torrijos, that, all right, I'm going along with what he's saying and I'm happy that I'm doing it, but what's the implications for him and ultimately for me? We knew the jackals were always there lurking in the shadows. And it was a tremendous push for us to do what we were supposed to do and do it efficiently so they wouldn't have to come in. They're very much a part of the system, and I knew a number of them personally, and I still do. I know a couple of them who are now in Iraq.
And do they work through U.S. governmental organizations like the CIA? And I ask that because we're looking at more and more in this day and age where private contractors, at least for military operations, are being used, the DynCorp, things like that.
Correct. That's how they work. The jackals, the jackals that I know are never CIA employees. They work for companies like Executive Solutions, companies with names like this. I'm not even sure they got the names right, but Global Alternatives. Most of these companies, incidentally, are offshore companies. They're British or Australian. They're not U.S. companies. So the people who work for them don't pay U.S. taxes. They don't pay any taxes. I have a good friend who's a jackal who's in Iraq today. He's been in this business for years. He's making over $300,000 a year tax-free. And they, of course, they're not paid by the Defense Department. They're usually paid, the companies get contracts with the State Department or some other organization, so they don't even show up on the books. We have thousands of people in Iraq today that are being sent in by private corporations this way that aren't on our military books. If they die, they're not included in the statistics. When they kill people, those people aren't included in the statistics. They're not in the budgets for the military, and they're not prohibited from doing the things that our military is prohibited by law from doing, such as torture. They're doing it, and they do it as private contractors. It's a huge business. Most of them came out of our military. They came out of Ranger units, Special Forces units. They're owned by and run by those people. Some of them came out of those kinds of units in other countries, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, England, France, but a lot of them come out of our own military.
Yeah, I know with Halliburton, one of your former company's competitors, they have numerous offshore holdings that they like to transfer their profits to, as well as of several months ago, the number of Halliburton employees who had been killed in Iraq was, I believe, at about 45. And that's not something you read about in the papers.
Right, and those are Halliburton employees. There's a lot of other people who work for Halliburton that wouldn't be classified as employees, that don't even make those kinds of statistics. And that's true in the industry, as is bribing. Great subject, bribing, because there's a number of newspaper articles out now about the fact that funds are unaccounted for. There's been scandals over the fact that a company like Halliburton or Bechtel or any of these companies that they spent $1 million for fuel or Coca-Cola or something else when they really should have only spent $600,000. There's that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people, when they read an article like that, they say, my God, well, I guess somebody in one of these companies was making $400,000 then by cheating the company, his own company. I mean, I wonder, what people do think. Whereas to me, it's very obvious. These kinds of monies are being used as bribes. This is as old as history. Our companies are prohibited by law from bribing people outright. I can't go in and say, I want to win this contract, Mike, so, here's $400,000. Make sure I get the contract. That's very illegal, and it's almost never done by U.S. companies. It is done by companies from other countries where it's not illegal or not as illegal. But our companies don't do that, and they pride themselves on their integrity for not doing that. Instead, what they do if I want to bribe you, if you're president, I want to bribe you. I want to give you $400,000. I'll say, well, do you have a brother or a friend who owns the John Deere franchise in this country? And you say yes, and so I'll negotiate a deal with that person to rent his equipment. I'll rent $600,000 worth of his equipment, and I'll pay $1 million. And there's nothing illegal about that. I can always fall back and say, "Oh my God, I didn't know I could have got it for $600,000. I cut a bad deal. How stupid of me." But it's obvious then that the side agreement is that extra $400,000 will go to you, the president. This happens all the time. At Charles T. Maine, our offices were filled with young men and women, but mainly men, from the countries where we worked, whose fathers were very high up in the governments. And we brought these young men in as interns at Charles T. Maine, paid them quite well, and in addition to that, we arranged for them to go to college in the United States, in Boston, at MIT or Harvard or Northeastern or BU or BC or wherever they could get in, and we could help them get in. We would usually give them a full scholarship or make sure they got one. We might pay for their housing and their food and give them a very nice salary as interns. So they might benefit to the tune of $50,000 a year, something along these lines, that really was a bribe to their parents, and yet there was nothing illegal about it. So much of this stuff that's done that is immoral, I think it's unethical, I think it really should be illegal, but the way it's done, it's legitimate, because the laws are written to protect this system, to protect what I call the corporatocracy, the big business, big banks, and government people who are running this empire.
Well, more and more it sounds like the laws are literally written by lobbyists from companies like the company that you worked for. Was there talk of that while you were in there, of tweaking legislation to create loopholes so your company could drive through those?
All of these companies have lobbyists in one form or another that are deeply involved in this. Some of the information that's come out at Vanity Fair and a number of other magazines did some and U.S. News and World Report did a very deep investigation of the Saudi relationship with our government back about a year ago. And, one of the things they found was that billions of dollars had come from Saudi Arabia to pay for lobbyists and to pay off former CIA employees, government officials, congressmen, Pentagon officials. This was all documented in those magazines, and it's footnoted in my book. I mean, if someone's looking for a reference, they can go directly to those magazines. Of course, it doesn't surprise me in the least bit, but it's a very, very corrupt system, and corruption can be done in extremely subtle ways.